There is a moment that historians call the turning point of the Pacific War. A moment so compressed, so violent, so disproportionate in its consequences to its duration, that serious military scholars have spent 80 years trying to fully explain how it happened. In 5 minutes, not 5 hours, not 5 days, but 5 minutes, the strategic balance of the entire Pacific Ocean shifted. 4 of the most powerful aircraft carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy, the crown jewels of the fleet that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, were put on the path to the bottom of the sea. And the weapon that did it was a dive bomber that the Japanese military had assessed, correctly, as slower than their fighters, less maneuverable than their fighters, and entirely within their ability to destroy before it reached its target. I know it didn't matter because I was in one of those dive bombers. My name is Harold Francis Egan. I was a rear seat gunner and radio operator in an SBD Dauntless dive bomber assigned to Bombing Squadron 6, VB6, operating from USS Enterprise. On the morning of June 4, 1942, at a point in the Pacific Ocean approximately 1,000 miles northwest of Honolulu, I watched my pilot push the nose of our aircraft over into a 70-degree dive aimed at the flight deck of the Japanese carrier Akagi, the flagship of the fleet that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. I watched the deck come up at us. I watched the anti-aircraft fire reach toward us from every direction. I watched the Zeros climbing to intercept us. But before I can tell you what happened on that flight deck, I need to tell you what had been happening in the 6 months that led to it. Because the Battle of Midway did not begin on June 4, 1942. It began on December 7, 1941, in the burning waters of Pearl Harbor, and everything that followed was the consequence of decisions made in that fire. I was at Pearl Harbor. I need to say that plainly because it matters to the story. I was 20 years old, a seaman second class assigned to the Aviation unit at Naval Air Station Ford Island, in the middle of Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese aircraft arrived at 7:53 on a Sunday morning. I was eating breakfast. I heard the first explosions and I thought, as almost everyone on the island thought in the first seconds, that it was an accident, an ordnance mishap, something that happened sometimes on military bases. I was walking toward the window when the second wave of explosions made clear that no accident produced that pattern of sound. What I saw from the Ford Island seawall in the next 2 hours I will not describe in full detail. Not because I cannot. I remember every moment with a clarity that 80 years have not dimmed, but because the story of Pearl Harbor has been told more completely and more authoritatively than I can tell it here. And because what matters for this particular story is not what I saw burning on that Sunday morning, but what I felt. What I felt, standing on that seawall watching battleships die, was something that I have seen described in various ways in the histories I have read since and that none of them quite capture. It was not rage. Not yet. Rage comes later, after the shock clears. What I felt in those first hours was something colder and more fundamental. A rearrangement. A permanent, structural rearrangement of the way the world worked and what I was going to have to do in it. I volunteered for aviation duty within the week. I wanted to fly. Not as a pilot, my eyesight had disqualified me from pilot training, but as a rear seat crew member, the man who manned the .30 caliber machine gun in the back of a dive bomber and operated the radio and watched the pilot's tail. I trained through the winter and spring of 1942 and was assigned to VB6 on Enterprise in April. My pilot was Lieutenant J.G. Thomas Fletcher, Tom Fletcher from Boise, Idaho, 23 years old. Calm in a way that I came to understand was not the absence of fear, but the extremely disciplined management of it. Tom Fletcher was the best pilot I ever flew with. I flew with him for 2 years, and he brought me home every time, which is the only metric that ultimately matters. The SBD Dauntless was not a beautiful aircraft. I want to establish this early because there is a tendency in the retrospective histories to romanticize the weapons of the Second World War, and the Dauntless does not need romanticizing. Its record speaks without decoration. It was a mid-wing monoplane, Single engine, 2 seats, with perforated dive flaps on the trailing edges of the wings that allowed the pilot to control speed during the dive without the aircraft accelerating past the point where the controls became unresponsive. It was slow in level flight. A Zero could catch it easily in a straight chase. It was not highly maneuverable. Its defensive armament, the .30 caliber in my hands in the rear seat, was adequate for discouraging pursuit, but not for winning a dogfight. In almost every comparison with contemporary fighter aircraft, the Dauntless came up short. The dive bombing technique that SBD crews trained to execute was a precision instrument. The pilot rolled the aircraft over at altitude, usually between 15 and 20,000 feet, and pushed into a steep dive, 60 to 70 degrees, nearly vertical, aiming not at where the ship was, but at where it would be when the bomb arrived. He held that dive, controlling speed with the dive flaps, keeping the target in his sights as the altitude unwound at a rate that compressed time into something almost hallucinatory. And at approximately 2,000 feet, sometimes lower, sometimes 1,500, sometimes lower still, he released the bomb and pulled out. The physics of the dive gave the bomb a trajectory that conventional horizontal bombing could never achieve. A near vertical fall onto the target that made evasion extremely difficult and accuracy dramatically higher than any other delivery method available in 1942. The problem, the terrible, ever-present problem that every dive bomber crew lived with, was the exposure. From the roll-in at altitude to the pull-out at 2,000 feet, the dive took approximately 30 seconds. 30 seconds of straight, predictable, non-maneuvering flight at a constant angle, toward a target that knew you were coming and was directing every anti-aircraft gun it had at your exact position. 30 seconds during which the Zeros could attack you, the flak could find you, and the only thing keeping you alive was the speed of the dive and the accuracy of the gunners trying to hit you, and the probability mathematics of whether the shell that was aimed at you happened to be the one that found you. The Japanese fleet that sortied toward Midway in late May of 1942 was the most powerful naval force ever assembled in the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku commanded more than 200 ships across multiple task forces, with the Core Strike Force, the Kido Butai, the Carrier Striking Force, consisting of 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were not simply ships. They were the same carriers with many of the same air crews that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Akagi was Yamamoto's flagship by prestige, if not by flag, the carrier that symbolized Japanese naval air power more than any other vessel. Together, the 4 carriers embarked more than 250 aircraft. They had, in the preceding 6 months, attacked Pearl Harbor, raided Darwin in Australia, devastated Allied naval forces in the Indian Ocean, and seemed, to most observers inside and outside Japan, to be essentially unstoppable. What they did not know, what Yamamoto did not know, what the entire Japanese Naval Command did not know, was that American cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese naval code. Not completely, not perfectly, but sufficiently. Sufficiently to know that the objective was Midway. Sufficiently to know the approximate date and the approximate axis of approach. Sufficiently to allow Admiral Chester Nimitz to position his 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, in an ambush position northeast of Midway, waiting for a fleet that believed it was the hunter and was, in fact, the prey. I did not know any of this on the morning of June 4th. Crew members at my level were not briefed on intelligence sources. We knew we were going to find Japanese carriers. We knew approximately where. We knew that the fight, when it came, was going to be the most important fight of the war to that point. The briefing officer on Enterprise the night before had said, and I remember this precisely, the exact words, "Gentlemen, the enemy fleet that attacked Pearl Harbor is within range of our aircraft. Tomorrow, we have the opportunity to make them pay for what they did on December 7th. Do not waste it." Nobody slept much that night. The morning of June 4th began with confusion, which is how most battles begin, regardless of how carefully they are planned. The initial search and attack missions from Midway Island itself went in first, achieving nothing against the Japanese combat air patrol, except the loss of many of their own aircraft. The torpedo bomber squadrons from the American carriers, Torpedo 8 from Hornet, Torpedo 6 from Enterprise, Torpedo 3 from Yorktown, launched their attacks in uncoordinated waves through the late morning, pressing in low and slow against the Japanese combat air patrol and the ship's anti-aircraft guns, and were slaughtered. Torpedo 8 lost every aircraft but one. The one survivor was Ensign George Gay, who watched the battle from the water after his aircraft went down. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese fleet that morning, 35 were shot down. The torpedo attacks achieved no hits. 35 aircraft lost. The men who flew those missions knew, when they launched, what the survival odds for torpedo bombers attacking a defended fleet were. They launched anyway. They pressed their attacks anyway, slow and low and terribly exposed, drawing the Japanese combat air patrol down to low altitude where it was occupied and occupied and occupied. The dive bomber groups from Enterprise and Yorktown reached the Japanese fleet at almost the same moment, coming from different approach angles, at altitude, with the Japanese Zeros pulled down to low level by the torpedo attacks and unable to climb back in time to intercept. This convergence, this precise, almost miraculous convergence of timing that put the dive bombers over the Japanese fleet at the exact moment when the fleet's fighter cover was most thoroughly compromised, was not entirely planned. It was partly the consequence of navigation errors and timing failures that had accidentally produced the perfect approach. War is like this. The plan is never what wins. What wins is the capacity to exploit what the plan accidentally creates. I will tell you what it looked like from my seat in the rear of Tom Fletcher's Dauntless at 20,000 feet above the Pacific on the morning of June 4th, 1942. The Japanese fleet was below us, and it was enormous. Not enormous in the way that photographs communicate enormousness, the flat, two-dimensional enormousness of ships seen from above in reconnaissance images. Enormous in the three-dimensional physical sense of a collection of vessels so large and so concentrated that they seemed to fill the ocean beneath us. The carriers were visible immediately, their flight decks distinctive, larger than the destroyers and cruisers clustered around them for protection. Akagi was recognizable by her island structure, offset to the port side in the distinctive configuration that identified her even from altitude. And on her flight deck, this detail I can see today as clearly as I saw it then, aircraft were spotted for launch. Dozens of aircraft, lined up on the deck, fueled and armed, ready to be launched in the strike that Yamamoto had planned to finish what Pearl Harbor had started. The Japanese crew had been cycling aircraft all morning, launching and recovering the Midway strike, rearming, preparing the next wave. The flight deck of the Akagi at that moment was a concentration of fuel and ordnance and machinery that represented simultaneously the greatest striking power and the greatest vulnerability in the Japanese fleet. The world outside the cockpit rotated 90 degrees and then kept rotating, and then we were pointed at the ocean and the ocean was coming up, and the Akagi was in the center of the sight, and the anti-aircraft fire was coming up from everywhere. Black puffs of smoke that appeared in the air around us with a suddenness that made them seem materialized rather than fired, and the tracers from the ship's guns drawing bright lines through the air that we were occupying, and somewhere below and behind us, the Zeros that had managed to start climbing, too late, too slow, reaching up toward us with their guns. 30 seconds. The dive took 30 seconds. I was firing the rear gun at anything that presented itself. A Zero climbing toward us, the gun traversing, the spent brass ejecting into the slipstream, the noise of the dive and the guns and the anti-aircraft fire combining into a physical pressure rather than a sound. I was doing my job. Tom Fletcher was doing his. The altimeter was unwinding. The Akagi was growing in the sight. The detail of her flight deck was becoming visible. The aircraft spotted for launch, the crew running, the guns of her own defensive battery firing upward at us. Tom pulled. The G-forces hit hard, the kind of sustained, compressive force that grazes the edges of your vision and makes the simple act of moving your hands feel like lifting weight. And we came out of the dive heading west, low over the water, throttle forward, running for distance between us and the fleet. I looked back. The Akagi was burning. Not the small, contained fires of a ship that has been damaged but will survive. The specific, terrible, expanding fire of a ship whose aviation fuel and ordnance have been ignited simultaneously. A fire that fed itself from the inside, that grew rather than diminished, that produced a column of black smoke visible from 50 miles, that told everyone in the fleet and everyone watching from aircraft above that the flagship was dying. I have been asked many times what I felt in that moment. I have given many answers. The true answer is that I felt nothing clearly identifiable for perhaps 30 seconds, because the dive and the pullout and the running egress occupied every part of my attention that was not being used to watch for Zeros coming from behind. The emotion arrived later, on the flight back to Enterprise, when the adrenaline had begun to metabolize and the facts of what had just happened were assembling themselves into something the mind could process. What I felt, when it arrived, was grief mixed with something I am not sure has a clean name. Grief for the men on that flight deck, Japanese sailors and aviators who had not chosen to be on Akagi any more than the men at Pearl Harbor had chosen to be on the ships that burned there. And alongside the grief, something that was not satisfaction exactly, but was close to it. The recognition that what had happened on December 7, 1941, had been answered. Not undone, never undone, but answered. Akagi sank the following morning, scuttled by Japanese destroyers after her fires proved uncontrollable. Kaga and Soryu had been hit in the same 5-minute window, the same convergence of dive bombers, the same burning flight decks, the same columns of black smoke rising above the Pacific. 3 carriers, the heart of the Kido Butai, put beyond saving in 5 minutes. Hiryu survived the morning. Her combat air patrol had been better positioned, her captain had maneuvered aggressively, and the dive bombers that attacked her in the initial strike had been driven off or destroyed before they could deliver their bombs. Hiryu launched her own counterstrikes, 2 waves of aircraft that found and badly damaged Yorktown, putting her dead in the water. For several hours on the afternoon of June 4th, it appeared that Hiryu might salvage something from the catastrophe. She didn't. A second strike from Enterprise, dive bombers again, SBDs again, the same aircraft and the same technique, found Hiryu in the late afternoon and hit her with 4 bombs. She burned through the night and sank the following morning. All 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were gone. I flew on the strike that hit Hiryu. I want to say that plainly because it is part of my story, and because I believe the men who flew the afternoon strike have received less historical attention than the men who flew the morning strike, and the afternoon strike was no less dangerous and no less decisive. Tom Fletcher put us into the dive again, and the anti-aircraft fire came up again, and the Zeros were there again, and we came out again, low over the water, running west. When I looked back the second time, the second carrier was burning. I flew with Tom Fletcher for 2 more years after Midway, through the Guadalcanal campaign, through the Gilbert Islands, through the first strikes on the Marianas. He was shot down once, in 1943 over Bougainville, and was rescued by a submarine 3 days later, which is a story that deserves its own telling. He survived the war and went back to Boise and opened a hardware store, which strikes me as exactly right. A man who spent 4 years delivering things with precision going into business, doing the same. I left the Navy in 1945 and went back to Boston. I worked for 30 years as an aviation logistics manager for American Airlines, and then retired to Cape Cod, where I have lived since 1975. The ocean is visible from my back porch. The same ocean, technically. The same Pacific that has Akagi and Hiryu and Kaga and Soryu somewhere in its floor, several miles down, in darkness and silence, and the slow process of returning to the elements they were made from. I think about the men on those ships. I have thought about them across the 80 years since June 4th, 1942. The Japanese pilots and sailors who died when those flight decks burned, men who had been doing their jobs, who had been trained to the same standards of professionalism and courage that I had been trained to, who had families and homes and reasons to come back. The war required that they die. I was part of the mechanism that killed them. I have carried that with the same weight that I have carried everything else from those years. Not as guilt exactly, because guilt implies a wrong choice, and there was no wrong choice available in the Pacific in 1942, but as weight. As the specific gravity of having been present at a moment when history pivoted and people died, and the dying was necessary, and it was still dying. The Battle of Midway is taught in every military academy in the world. It is studied as the example of how intelligence, surprise, and the exploitation of a single tactical window can reverse a strategic imbalance that by every conventional measure should have been decisive. Japan had more ships, more aircraft, more experience, more of almost everything that military planners count. What America had was broken code, 3 carriers in the right place, and 41 torpedo bomber crews who flew into certain death to pull the Japanese combat air patrol down to low altitude so that the dive bombers above could have 30 seconds of relatively clear air. Relatively clear. I want to be precise about that. It was never clear. The anti-aircraft fire was never absent. The Zeros were never completely neutralized. Men died in the dive on June 4th, 1942. Men whose aircraft were hit before they could release, who went into the Pacific still in their cockpits. Men who released and pulled out and were caught by Zeros in the egress. The 30 seconds of relative advantage that the torpedo bombers purchased with their lives was 30 seconds of marginally reduced impossibility. That was enough. In the specific mathematics of dive bombing against a defended fleet, marginally reduced impossibility was sufficient. I was 21 years old on June 4th, 1942. I am 103 years old now, one of the last surviving veterans of the Battle of Midway, which is a distinction I hold with a mixture of pride and the particular solemnity that comes from being almost the last person alive who can say, I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. The carriers burned, and the smoke rose, and the Pacific changed. To the men of Torpedo 8, to the men of Torpedo 6 and Torpedo 3, who flew their slow, low, unprotected aircraft into the guns of the Japanese fleet and did not come back. Your deaths were not wasted. I know that is inadequate. I know that telling men who died that their deaths had strategic value does not give them back their lives or their futures or their names in the newspapers. But it is true, and it is the only truth I have to offer across the distance of 80 years. The dive bombers arrived above a fleet whose fighters were low because you had pulled them there. We had 30 seconds. We used them. The Akagi burned because of you. The Hiryu burned because of you. The war turned because of you. I was there when the SBD Dauntlesses sank the Akagi and the Hiryu. I was in the rear seat of one of them. I watched the flight decks burn from 1,800 feet in a 70-degree dive at 300 miles per hour, and I watched the smoke rise into the Pacific sky, and I flew back to Enterprise, and I landed, and I sat in the aircraft, and I thought about Pearl Harbor, and I thought about December 7th, and I thought about the rearrangement that had happened on that Sunday morning, and whether this burning fleet, this shifting balance, this 5 minutes that changed the ocean, whether this was what the rearrangement had been pointing toward. I believe it was. I believe the men who died making it possible believed the same thing. The Pacific is very large and very deep and very old. It was here before any of us, and it will be here after all of us. But on one day in June of 1942, in a space of 5 minutes, in 30-second dives at 70 degrees, it became a different ocean. I was there.